Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar of IMI's AdaptSmart Consortia. My name is Dwayne Schultes, and greetings from the eHealth Week here in Tallinn, Estonia. Before we begin, I'd like to simply walk you through some of the tools that you can use to ask us questions and communicate with us. If you're having audio problems, we have provided 24 free telephone numbers for you to call in. So if you're using your computer audio and you're having difficulty, you can switch between the computer and the phone, and we have several calls that you can dial in for free, and then you'll be able to interact. And during the last half hour of the webinar, we're going to be taking questions, and there is a question bar. So please feel free to submit your questions that you may have, and we will gladly answer them as they come forward. So today, we're grateful to the Estonian Ministry of Social Affairs for hosting this webinar, allowing us to discuss their best practices in the use of health data and how this can help facilitate adaptive approaches to new medicines coming to the market. And we're pleased today to be joined by Aine Vescu, the Deputy Secretary General on e-Services. Hello, Aine. Good afternoon. We're also joined by Stanimir Huziriev, the Secretary General of Patient Access Partnership. He's in Brussels, as I understand. Good afternoon, Stanimir. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks.
Thank you very much. Also joining Aine and I here in Estonia is Thomas Alman from EPIA. Good morning, afternoon, Thomas.
Good afternoon, nice to be here.
And we're also joined remotely by Peter Stolk in Amsterdam, who's the project manager from Ligature at the AdaptSmart project. Good afternoon, Peter. How are you?
Good afternoon, Dwayne. I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're just going to begin now. I'd like to offer the floor to Aine Vescu, who's going to walk us through the work that they've been doing here in Estonia. And Aine, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dwayne. Hello, everyone. Happy to welcome you here from Tallinn, both physically, some of you are with me, and I am very happy about it, but also over the modern information and communication technologies. So being digital is what we like here. I'm going to tell you a brief story about how national e-health system can support adaptive pathways. This is something we are currently using, but I'm also going to tell how far we are with adaptive pathways in the real world. To kick off, really briefly, just 4 key features of Estonian healthcare system, which would a little bit tell you why we have built the system we have and why we think this actually could be practically useful for many other places in the region as well. So first, we have funding, which is central in the sense that we have earmarked social insurance tax. It is flat rates, and we have single public purchaser. Country is not that big, 1.4 million inhabitants, works fine there. But the operators who provide care are decentralized and private. They operate under private law, so to say. They are controlled by public entities, municipalities, or a state, but they are independent in their decisions, including what kind of information systems they use and also how they actually operate their internal work processes, including pathways, to the extent that there are some of them which are mandated by the state. But then again, as we know, many of them, be it for certain clinical trials or just for internal purposes, are managed locally. And then primary care is also separate from hospital network, and again, they are independent private providers. We do have universal free access. 50% of outpatient contacts take place in primary care setting. So for most of the complex cases, you can imagine that people are traveling between primary and secondary care. The backbone of the National Health Information System is Secure Data Exchange Layer. We call it X-Road, and it has also identification, digital identification feature, either through ID card or mobile ID, but it could be any other. So they are kind of 2 separate systems that function together. X-Road makes certain that you see here just an example of some of the public databases, but also private databases, because remember, some of the providers are private, which can connect and build whatever kind of services in between them in a secure way and exchange data, which has been agreed beforehand. And then bottom right, you see a nationwide health information system, which is also both a repository, but also it can host kind of brokering services between those other databases. So they sound or seem a bit busy and technical, but the labels of the databases and information systems aren't important. The fact is that, again, with this slide, the main message is that there are many, many services that you can build on top of this kind of platform. And this is just an example, and the darker the bubble, the more advanced the service in Estonia has been developed. And to summarize it here, the architecture, that is the technology, is designed to facilitate without limitations for any professional while working at any provider to seek change any data about any individual at any situation. So this is the principle. So you can summon people physically in the same room around the patient. GP, cardiologist, internist, clinical psychologist, home health nurse, whatever. And in physical room, they can exchange information. They can talk to each other and know what the others have been doing. Now, in the digital domain, very often those people find difficulties exchanging information. This is what the technology that we have built in Estonia enables, is to overcome technically those barriers. And then come the rules. So each of them is identified digitally, which means that we know who is doctor in the role of GP, who is doctor in the role of professional, who is home health nurse, or otherwise. And their role assigns their rights, what kind of information they can see, when they can see that information, what should be brought them onto their screen, and how that should be integrated. So that is, in addition to the technology, what legal framework and data governance brings. And just a few examples. So what we can do and what we can reap from all databases, so primary care encounters, specialist care encounters, you can see the timeline of one patient over the time with different diseases and the encounters that they have had. And well, in Estonian case, we can even go backwards. So because we do have digital identity, we can link backwards. So you see the recruitment date and things that have happened after that. But if need be and necessary, you can go back and also link other information to that. And then how could that be used for adaptive pathways? The example is an e-consultation, whereby patients in the top visits a family doctor. Sorry about the typo. Compiles e-referral documentation. So the family doc sends through the Digilugu. In the center is this national health information system. So that facilitates only medical documentation, the preset information between family doctor and hospitals, to the hospital specialists, who will view, and in most cases this is the case that cannot be managed at the primary care level. And then there is the decision-making point in the pathway. So what to do? Should I keep it in the primary care level, or do I need to take it up at the hospital? Also, at the hospital side, you can decide whether you respond just based on this medical information that you received from a primary care provider, or you make an appointment, the physical appointment, if need be, basis with the patient. Anyway, if that solution has been sorted out with the hospital, they send feedback, the consultation reports, virtual or office visit, depending on what the decision was, and hand over patient back to the GP side. And they receive this feedback, but importantly, the patient portal gives the same feedback also to the patient. So you can design these kind of services. Remember, you can define any kind of encounters and information exchange using the system. So where are we right now? What are we planning to do? The strategy is, we do have currently local clinical pathways. So GPs and hospitals are using them the way they want. Remember, they are independent. The software tools they're using are there to choose. Health insurance fund is deploying, starting from next year, central pathway logistics for GPs. So it will be then trying to reduce the variation between the pathways, provided this central support. And then, in addition to GPs pathways, we will integrate different pathways for chronic care management in an integrated way. And in certain points of time, for those pathways, there will be clinical decision support systems integrated. So again, what kind of diagnosis to do, what kind of treatment to offer, where to refer the patient. So this is how the adaptive systems can be implemented on top of this backbone of the system, which can integrate different providers and combine them into a flow of actions the way you design. So thank you.
That's really fascinating. Thank you very much, Ein. This is a big problem, the ability to combine primary care databases with principal hospital data or insurance data. How have you managed to do that? Because that's a big barrier to most health authorities. How have you managed, either one, to get the buy-in from the doctors, and two, technically, how have you managed to pull that off?
Okay, that's an interesting question because for us, we don't understand the question because this is where we started from.
Right.
The whole country, not just in healthcare, but the whole public services are built on the integration. Because remember, I didn't tell you the important part. In Estonia, legally, the data is owned by the patient, by citizen. So the default is that if citizen wants to get treatment by another physician, well, the previous information has to be on the table or on the screen of that physician. And in Estonia, really, people are very annoyed if their visit yesterday from to a GP is not available, because then they are mad to their physicians, to the specialists they're attending, or to the state why they haven't provided the service, because it should be there. And if it's not, then it means that the first doctor hasn't done that job properly and sent the documents in time.
So what you mentioned here that users can define the metrics and the availability of their data based on their preferences,
yes,
which I think is, again, that's a key part to making this work, the system work to have clinical applications beyond, your health system. What percentage of the population is actually actively engaged in doing this and managing their own health?
Currently, it is somewhere between 30 and 50%,
so
and by actively mean at least once per month. And it is very dependent on if we introduce new services.
Right.
In the beginning of this year, people could see how much health insurance fund has paid for their services, and then many people started actually to see what was billed for them to the health insurance fund, and they actually match with the services they get. And since we are rolling out new services, we believe, and the goal is to get to 80% in the next 2 years.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much. We will certainly be taking questions from the audience as we move forward. I'd like to also bring in Stanimir now so we can have his perspective from Eastern Europe. Stanimir, you're a patient representative from Bulgaria. You're the director of the Patient Access Partnership. The floor is yours. Thank you for your participation.
Yes, thank you very much. I actually try to bring some patient perspective from the region. And before this webinar, I did a small exercise with some of our patient contacts in some of those countries, and you will see later what's the response. I think the region is quite challenging. We all know that. And it's really amazing what a country as Estonia can achieve. Compared to all the other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. It's really something that we can learn from, but is the entire region there yet? This is the question I will try to answer today. So having the added value for the patients of maps, and I'm not going to focus on all the added value, the accelerate access to areas where we have unmet patient needs, etc. But I'll try to focus a bit more on the challenges. The region is really diverse. We have some common challenges there. In many of the countries, there's no or very few infrastructures that are working together, and you will see some examples later. In some countries, there's not even sufficient and systematically collected data, deficiency and inappropriate use of resources. Political instability is a great factor in those countries. Even if we have governments that are willing to do something, very often these governments change, and then with the new government, everything starts from the very beginning. So this is a very high risk factor for many of those countries. Sometimes it's the absence of know-how, lack of motivation of the administration to do it, because we do believe in those countries that the administration is self-supporting itself with different legislations, and actually being electronic is probably not the best thing they can do for themselves. And of course, corruption is still a big issue for the region. So now for the exercise we did, we contacted 3-4 patient representatives from different countries, asking their perspective on how far and how prepared they are, if they have systematic data collection, how sophisticated are their electronic systems and e-health, and you will see the result is quite disappointing. So in Slovakia, they believe that the information is very fragmented, and many of the different modules are developed in different hospitals without having common information that should be exchanged between them. So in most of the cases, the information cannot be used by the others, and not even from the government. From Bulgaria, 5 different governments promised to start the health system. All of them only tried to start something, and they're starting from very beginning. Our latest government actually is again trying to start, but we still don't have even one registry for any disease area. The last example comes from Romania. The healthcare system seems a bit more developed from the Bulgarian one, but still the databases are fragmented, they don't communicate to each other, they are not linked and not structured in a way that is reasonable and can be used for proper policy decisions or for proper decisions in the interest of patients. So it sounds disappointing, but this is the reality. And we have to face this reality and to see how we can help or probably change this reality in those countries. So here's some suggestions on what we can do in the future, because it is as it is right now. Probably the first step we have to do is have real evaluation of the situation in those countries, because these are just opinions coming from different patients. Probably the doctors have different perspective, probably the hospitals have different perspective, probably the governments have different perspective, but still we don't have what's the real situation in most of the countries. Can we use European tools and available resources for encouraging and accelerating the e-health in these countries? Can we have more tailored structural funds, and can the Commission play a role in this process to tailor them and to make them a bit more specific based on the real needs and identified priorities by those countries? Can the countries receive technical support on the real implementation or even in the planning phase? And last but not least, best practice exchange. I know that many governments are looking into what is happening in Estonia, but I don't believe they really understand what's going on there and how far our Estonian fellows in this. So how can we make this more practical, more prominent? And believe me, Bulgarians do believe much more to Estonians rather than countries as the big old member states. It's just a historical thing, and I do believe that this is very typical for our region. And at the end, is the way having a unified EU standards for data. If we have that, could it be helpful for all of the countries that are taking their own way and road on creating their e-health systems? This is my suggestions for solutions, but of course I'm sure even the audience would have many more.
Thank you, Stanimir.
Thank you.
Just a quick question on the patient usage of data and the unified data standards. If you look at a lot of the successful platforms, Stanimir, they're often driven by various institutions or organizations supplying data themselves, and then that data being processed remotely and then providing the results. Do you think a patient-driven solution, or one where the patients themselves are driving the data, your members, would that be a potential way around some of the bottlenecks you're facing in Eastern Europe?
Yes, I do believe this might be a way, but we still are missing a major element that was presented as the major path in Estonia. They have established certain principles on how the data should be collected, how data should be exchanged between different stakeholders, who can have access on that. And then on top of this, everyone can create his own solution depending on the needs. I think this is what's really missing in the region.
No, I agree. And how do you see this, just quickly, how do you plan on trying to move this forward from your side? What are you trying to do actively to promote better usage of data, or at least more engagement?
I can talk on behalf of my country, and we use the fact that the current government is very open for discussion and really willing to do the first steps of the health system very fast. So we have a permanent consultative body that I'm leading in the country under the Council of Ministers, and the minister personally asked the consultative body to help with ideas on how we build the system. So we are trying also to get some experts from countries that are much more advanced from us to help us really build it from scratch. Probably this is also an advantage, not having anything in a country, not even single registry, maybe a best possibility to copy paste, but this is for my country. I really don't know what can happen and what can work in Romania or in Hungary or in some of the other countries in the region.
Okay, well, thank you, Stanley. We'll certainly discuss this more. Again, we'll be taking questions during the last 20 minutes, 25 minutes of the webinar. Please submit them on your question bar. We're going to move on now to Thomas Alvin. Thomas is here with us in Estonia. Hello, Thomas.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. Let me pull up your PowerPoint here. And you're going to give sort of an overview on where things are going through the IMI projects and how FBI and the industry is involved. Thank you very much, Thomas.
Yes. Thank you, Duane. Good technology. Right. So we're talking about data and real world data. I think in the industry we are more and more having a sort of a joined up holistic view of what health data is and what should be used for. Obviously, I have a lot of experience in working with data in clinical research and development. But now we're talking about real world data. It's basically for us everything that is not data from randomized clinical trials. So it can be all kinds of sources, right? It's health records, it can be registries, patient-reported outcomes. So everything that goes on in clinical practice in the real world. So what actually happens with the patients when they're in the clinic, when they're out in the daily life, etc. And then big data, try to combine all this, and also using other non-health kind of data like social media, lifestyle, risk factors, consumer behavior, and also other kinds of health data like genomics, imaging, etc. Real-world evidence, which is really what's needed for these sort of adaptive pathways, outcome-based models, is sort of getting evidence from this real-world data, because the data for itself doesn't speak. You need to analyze it to get evidence for a decision, some kind of decision, regulatory or a clinical decision, and that's a real trick to make that work. And I mean, here's quickly, some of the different use cases for real data. Everything from guiding new research and developments of new therapies, is supporting regulatory decision making, including the kind of adaptive pathways, pharmacovigilance, of course, to monitor adverse events, supporting HTA, supporting treatment decisions in the hospitals, and just understanding how current patient pathways work, so what kind of outcomes they give, and also guiding patient choice and doing health system performance assessment and just basically quality improvement of healthcare. And here's, for instance, my own home country, Sweden, where we I think in 2006 started to make public outcomes data from different hospitals and regions. You could compare, which hospital is doing best in different disease areas, and then they can also learn from each other. And it creates sort of an upward pressure quality-wise, because no one wants to be at the bottom of the dashboard kind of thing. And also, lastly here, also different kinds of outcomes-based payment models, which is something we're looking into more and more. And here you can see different kinds of managed entry agreements. So when a company and a payer makes an agreement for a new innovative medicine, and there might be uncertainty for a new medicine, both on the budget impact, so how many patients will actually get this drug, and also will it actually work and how well and for which patients. And this uncertainty can create a lot of anxieties for the payer. So that you can conclude an agreement, and you can either, you see at the bottom here, the different kind of outcomes-based agreements, where you can either have a conditional coverage, so you reimburse the drug, but then you collect data, real-world data from clinical practice and see, did it actually work as well as we thought? Or you can have a direct performance-linked reimbursement. So you, for instance, only pay for the patients that actually respond to the drug. And this is something we see now, for instance, for the new hepatitis C medicines, has become quite popular. Now, there are a lot of barriers. We like to talk about barriers, maybe too much, but in implementing these kind of models, and there's everything from obviously political and organizational and legal when it comes to the handling of data, to more the data requirements themselves, or how to collect this real data, and is the infrastructure there? So a lot what Stanimir talked about. Do you have the electronic health records? Do you have registries? And all these things, and also the metric definitions. So how do you define an outcome? What is it that you're actually collecting? There's also, as I said, sort of a political, organizational part of this. So is there acceptance in the system for using real-world evidence to make decision-making healthcare systems? And here we have a lot of different philosophies between European countries. And then, of course, different contract models for if you want to do a performance-based payment model for a new medicine or another kind of healthcare service. It can be a surgical procedure, it can be a knee replacement. So what are we doing from FBI? So through the Innovative Medicines Initiative, we've had a lot of projects working on the real-world data angle from different perspectives. And we have, for instance, the Real project really looked at developing toolkits for using real-world data, and we have also the one of the newer programs, the Big Data for Better Outcomes, which you can see on the next slide, where we're really diving into specific disease areas. You can see in the bottom, Alzheimer's, hematologic malignancies, etc. And trying to define the real-world outcomes you want to get to, and then try to identify the data sources, real-world data sources for this, and use that to improve healthcare delivery. So these are projects that are ongoing right now and are starting to deliver results. And you can see also here in red our newest project that will fit into this structure, the European Health Data Network, which is something that is not yet up and running, but the call for this was launched in July with a deadline now in October. So that will mean that the private and public consortia will be formed thereafter. So this is 12 FBI companies who have invested cash to build basically an infrastructure for collecting data to power these other disease-specific projects in BD4BO. And what this is really about is rolling out a common data model, because one of the, as you saw in one of my previous slides, one of the main barriers is interoperability of data. So how can you link the data, and how can you bring together data sets from different hospitals if we want to do a large-scale analysis of the same kind of patients, but they are in different hospitals all over Europe. And usually today, every hospital and clinic have their own database that is structured in a specific way. So it's difficult to link. But what the European Health Data Network will do is to implement a common data model, which will make sure that the data, whatever they have collected, is structured in the same way. And that will make it much easier to then do an analysis in the same way in all these hospitals. And the key trick about the European Health Data Network is that it will be a federated what's called a federated model, which will mean that the data will not move. The patient level data will stay in the hospitals, in the registries, wherever they are. But because it's structured in the same way, a researcher can send the same research questions to all these different hubs at the same time. They will do the analysis based on the agreed upon metrics, and then you only pool the results. You aggregate the result, and then you get a much bigger scale analysis of this data.
And then that cures the data ownership problem, because the data lives where the data lives, and then you're only looking at the output.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. So thereby you avoid many of these, not all, but many of these sort of legal hurdles and on data privacy, etc.
Excellent. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
Boy, a lot we could ask here, but unfortunately we'd like to press on. One other IMI project, obviously, that's been involved a lot in the usage of data is the AdaptSmart project. And to conclude the presentation part of this afternoon in the webinar, we're going to be hearing from Peter. Hello, Peter. Are you with us?
Yes, Dwayne. Hello.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Peter. The floor is yours, sir.
Good afternoon. Yes, well, thank you, Dwayne. And I think we already heard quite a lot of very interesting things and topics for discussion. So I will just give a very short presentation to provide some context on this topic from the perspective of the AdaptSmart project. So those of you who are not familiar with AdaptSmart is an IMI project which was launched in mid-2015 and will run until the end of this year. So we are reaching our final months of the project. We are planning to hold a closing event in March of next year, where we will showcase all our results and also conduct some real world or some simulations and scenario discussions to wrap up the project. So we will be announcing that shortly. The project consists of FPR companies and public organizations, patients organizations, health technology assessment bodies, academia, and is led by Hans-Georg Eifler from the EMA, with Solange Rohu from AstraZeneca as a co-lead on the industry side. So, well, I assume you're all quite familiar with the MAPS concept. So, but MAPS is a concept of medicines development and regulation and access, which seeks to foster access to beneficial treatment for the right patient at the earliest appropriate time in a sustainable fashion. And sustainable also means here not only sustainable for the regulators, for industry, but also for the payers and the patients. So MAPS is a prospectively planned approach. So and it fits within the current regulatory framework. So an important part of the MAPS approach is dialogue early in drug development to plan accordingly for the appropriate procedures during medicines development and after initial marketing authorization. As such, MAPS is not something where we want to create a new regulatory pathway. I think it's important to emphasize that. That will come back later as well. But we rather want to make use of existing tools and methods. So, for example, we could make use of elements of the conditional marketing authorization, optimal use of the scientific advice procedure, etc., etc. So it's really based on current tools, methods within the current regulatory framework. And AdaptSmart is not a policy think tank where we want to prescribe new policies or write new regulations, but rather it is a platform where we want to facilitate discussion and interactions between all healthcare stakeholders. So it's really a multi-stakeholder project. So just on before I go a little bit more into how we incorporated the real-world data and real-world evidence into our thinking in this area, maybe it's good to highlight a little bit on what has been achieved. So One of the important achievements, I think, is that we have agreed on what we are going to do in the project. As you can imagine, the group that forms the Adapt Smart Consortium is a highly diverse group. For example, we also have involvement from some of the payers in Europe. They are not formally a partner, but rather a very active observer in the project. And of course, industry is there, patient organizations, HTA bodies, the EMA, etc., etc. So we have quite a diverse group of stakeholders with sometimes diverging agendas, but we are very happy and proud that we agreed on the scope of the project and what we are planning to achieve. Also, I think that we have achieved quite a good buy-in from outside stakeholders. So in Canada, Australia, Japan, and the US through our international advisory board. So we have been actively working with our advisory board, representing, for example, payers in the US, regulators in Canada and in Japan, patient organizations from the US, so quite a broad, diverse group from outside of Europe. And maybe also it's good to emphasize here that in the final months of the project, and I think this webinar is part of it, we will be especially focusing on Central and Eastern European member states, so that we try to contribute to the discussion in that area of the European Union as well. And as another example of that, the final event that I was just mentioning will be held in a Central European member state. So we will be announcing that officially shortly, but as it stands now, we will likely have that event in Budapest. So that's just a little bit about some of the achievement in terms of stakeholder engagement. If we go to the next slide, so these are some of the results that you can find on our website. So we have, I think, a very interesting report there on engagement criteria for MAPS, and I think that that's one of the key issues when we a MAPS approach to drug development and regulation can be quite requires quite a lot of buy-in from different parties. So it's important to determine in which instances you will and will not do that. So we wrote a discussion paper on that, which is quite a broad buy-in. Also, we took a deep dive into all the regulatory pathways and decision points that are part of the drug development process, and try to map them and try to identify where sort of the key transition points are and how those transitions could be made more efficient and effective in a MAPS approach. We have very nice work on managed entry agreements, and Jacqueline Bouvier from NICE has led a lot of those efforts together with the industry colleagues, and I think that has led to some really interesting reports and a forthcoming paper. Also, and that's something where we're really looking towards the future, where we are currently finalizing a report which tries to identify what we don't know yet. So what are the research gaps, what are issues to be addressed in future research, and some of the activities around real world data, real world evidence play an important role there. And finally, and I think, that's some of the things come back to later, it was also mentioned before, it begins with good definitions so that you have a agreed upon the lexicon of what you are talking about. We also have a glossary which was just updated and is available on our website. So in view of the time, I will skip this slide because I think I have already addressed most of it. So if we go to the definitions, so how we understand within Adapt Smart real world data is really as an umbrella term for all kinds of different data regarding the effects of health interventions that are collected both prospectively and retrospectively from observations in routine clinical practice. And it can come from a variety of sources, including patient registries, electronic medical records, and observational studies, but also, for example, a clinical trial. So if we think about a pragmatic clinical trial where we really conduct a randomized study in a real-world setting, that also will generate real-world data. So it can also be from a randomized interventional study. So it's important, I think, to note that. And for details on this definition and the sources, I refer you to our glossary. And that real-world data then leads to real-world evidence, which is the evidence derived from the analysis or synthesis of this real-world data. And one of the things that we found was that when we discussed this in the consortium, is that there's quite a lot of divergence in Europe on what is real-world data, and it was, as was mentioned earlier as well, sometimes it's also seen as data that is only collected in a non-randomized way, but we think that it should be seen as broader than that. So then, if we go to the next slide, I think also it's important within the context of maps and real-world data just to emphasize. This is some of the criticisms that we sometimes hear about, both in terms of maps and also in terms of real-world data, that maps seeks to downgrade randomized clinical trials or data generated from the trials and to replace it with a real-world evidence type of information, and that by definition, non-RCT data is less reliable, more prone to bias, and that means that we will have more reliable information. So I think it's good to emphasize here that in a MAPS pathway, we do not, or within the thinking of Adapt Smart in the context of MAPS, we do not think that RCTs are no good or should not be done. We recognize that RCTs are the methodology with the highest internal validity, but at the same time that it could be valuable to really embrace the full evidence spectrum, just to use studies from a different sources. So, for example, next to RCTs, to use pragmatic trials, to use observational studies, etc., etc. So it's not either or, but it can be and, so to say. So real-world data should complement rather than replace randomized controlled trials. So there's a right study type for the right type of question. So both of these tools, or all the different tools, have their place, and it's something that should be combined. And I think that is also something that I just wanted to highlight in the next slide before I open it up to more detailed questions. Is let's say in a MAPS case, and how we see this in Adapt Smart, and this data of this slide was borrowed from Hans-Georg Eisler. We could also see it as we have to be a little bit creative, I think, in selecting the type of evidence or the type of method that we want to choose from our toolbox to generate the appropriate evidence. So, for example, if in an earlier study a drug shows a very high rate of success, that could mean that we could go for, given that there is acceptable toxicity, we could go for an initial indicated license, perhaps with some prescribing controls to support it, and then collect real-world data to complement that, and to perhaps then translate that marketing authorization into a broader or a fuller authorization later. But at the same time, if success is of a compound is not yet very convincing, we do require the RCTs. We go through the full package, and will only go for an initial license later on when sufficient evidence has been collected. And of course, if success is too low, then it's just a no-go. So I just wanted to emphasize that within the MAPS pathway, within Adapt Smart, we see and within our thinking about MAPS, we see real-world evidence and real-world data as a critical source of evidence, especially from an HTA and payer perspective. We do not see it as something that will replace the RCT. Rather, it is, I think, something that should complement it or should be combined with RCT data in order to provide the optimal mix of evidence for regulatory decision making, for HTA and payer decision making, and to optimally inform patients and prescribers when making treatment decisions. So happy to go into more details about AdaptSmart and what we did in this area, and I give the floor back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Peter. I appreciate that. Just going to bring everybody in now, so we're going to take some questions. Just quickly, since we've got everyone now unmuted and online, Peter, just going to you, how much of this is being dictated by the reality of some of the new therapeutic areas? If we look at immuno-oncology, if we look at what's happening with CAR T, cancer, how much of this is being dictated by the fact that we have these very complex responses that go months and months and years in some cases, but we're only looking at a phase 3 that's 6 to 8 months long? How much is this addressing the reality of new therapeutics?
Well, I think a lot is dictated by that, and I think it's not only you mentioned oncology, but also when I think of other therapeutic areas and areas of future urgent or high medical needs. So, for example, let's say in Alzheimer and perhaps some of the other psychiatric illnesses, I think we see that same issue. So we do, let's say in Alzheimer, we do a phase 3 trial, but we do not have the opportunity to observe the full course of the treatment effect or disease progression. So I think if we want to bring new therapies to the market for in those areas, we would require this kind of thinking as well.
Thank you, Peter. I mean, from your perspective, how much work is Estonia doing looking at some of these complex response rates with some of these new areas like immuno-oncology or some of the new things coming where you have really uneven response, but you have very active, treatments?
Right. I think we are in the wide or everyday application. We are really in the beginning. As said, our hospitals in their activities are quite independent. But what I can tell is that the recent decision by the government to increase the funding of health insurance fund, and then also reorganize a little bit how the whole uptake of new technologies and innovation is going to be, specifically said that we should embrace these kind of more complex but more outcome and pragmacy-driven approaches. So piloting at the hospital level, yes. At the national level, there is planning phase, and somewhere in the beginning of next year, some sort of suggestion how on a nationwide scale we should roll this up, starting from what has been done, infrastructure, all the engagement of stakeholders, careful rollout, but having in mind that this extra money which will be spent by the government has to be spent differently as compared to so far.
Just want to remind people we're going to do in the last 10 minutes or so where we have a few questions. Please feel free to submit your questions via the question bar. There's a David Schwicker who has asked, for rare diseases, a good opportunity to collect real-world data before product authorization could be an early access compassionate use named patient program. Not all patients can be included in clinical studies. Is there a regulatory provision for such programs in Estonia? So patient compassionate use at the Estonian level, I guess that would also have to have a requirement of buy-in from the company that you're giving away the medicines for free, I suppose.
Yes. So I would say that in principle this is possible, but this is really case-by-case basis decision. And we have very good, very strong medicines agency working very closely with the EMA, and at the same time, I know that there have been specific cases where this has been tried. Don't know exactly, that is outside of my expertise area, which areas, but we are moving in that direction.
Thank you very much. And Stanimir, from your perspective, how do you see compassionate use playing into this? And obviously, I'm sure you feel much like I do that we should be capturing that data if possible.
Obviously, compassionate use should be considered, and it's a chance for many patients, and it's a right for the patient to have compassionate use when they decide on that. But I think that we have to see where the unmet patient needs and which are the disease areas where there's really big need, nothing available, no alternatives, and at the same time the new compounds coming should be with 80% success rate or whatever it's defined. I don't think there are so many areas where we can meet these two criteria: unmet patient need and the 80%. Do you have idea now, or have someone done kind of research of the patient needs and unmet patient needs, where the research should go?
Geez, that's a very good question. Thomas, have you done any work on patient need versus unmet? The patient needs with getting access to drugs from compassionate use. Has FP done any work in this area?
No, I don't think we have done a specific work on that. I mean, of course, we're always working on trying to analyze what is the actual unmet need, and there's a lot of definitions on that. But no, nothing in particular.
Okay, that's fine. We have a question here from a B. Johnson, which I just want to clarify. Is randomized clinical trial data not considered to be real data in the definition of real-world data? Yeah, this is it's a good question because there's a lot of confusion about what is clinical trial data and what is not. If we look at the RAND Corporation data, Mr. Johnson, the definition by RAND is that real-world data is any data that's not randomized clinical trial data. That's if we use the RAND Corporation. Peter, do you have any extension on that from Adapt Smart's perspective?
Yeah, obviously I don't agree with the RAND Corporation. No, but and also that's something we took our definition for real world data. I was based on the Get Real project, where this was also another IMI project where this was also broadly discussed. So well, in line with the definition of Adapt Smart, and my view would be that a randomized controlled trial can generate real-world data depending on the setting of the study. So if the study, like for example, a famous example, the Salford lung study is a randomized controlled trial, pre-launch done by GSK. It generates something that's close to real world data. I mean, if you control a trial, there's always some deviation from the reality as it presents itself without a study being conducted. But I think it depends on the setting, and we do have to, as a final remark, we do have to take into consideration that it's a continuum. So a study can be well, let's say in a very well-controlled environment and be further away from a real-world setting, or it can be very close to a real-world setting and anywhere in between. So to be short, I disagree with the RAND Corporation, and randomized controlled trials can generate real-world data depending on the setting, in my opinion.
I ran a session at DIA 2 years ago. Steve Rosenberg was on the panel. He said, real-world data, you mean data? ? So I don't know if we'll ever solve this completely, but thank you, Peter. Do you have an opinion on that? Is randomized controlled trial data, do you consider that real-world data, or is there a definition, or is it just data? What's your opinion on this?
I take it very simply. I agree that real-world data can be also. Sorry, the randomized controlled trial can also generate real-world data. So, but not all real-world data is obviously can be seen as a clinical trial data.
Stanimir, here's a question for you. This is from Ingvar de Goyer. Are there examples where payers are reimbursing drugs in development for patients with unmet needs while collecting real-world data? Would that be compassionate use, Stanimir, by your definition? Conditional
Well,
approval.
compassionate use is when payers are not paying at the end. It's something that the companies are providing for
What
free.
about conditional approval? Conditional approval?
I think there conditional improvement. I think there are some examples here and there, but it's not something that happens in all countries or all payers. It's just opening to this direction, and I think they're very careful when exploring these opportunities. But I think this is the way forward.
Thank you very much. We have another question here from Amin Konga. The adaptive creative is an interesting concept, but how are we going to convince the payers to accept phase 1 or 2 data? Where is AdaptSmart's next step in publishing this report? Peter, how is that working with the payers? Do you think, I think we agree in principle that adaptive creative would be an interesting way to approach this. Where are we at with getting the payers on board?
Well, I think progress in this I think is being made, but I think a lot of it will come from case studies and pilots. So, for example, the payers have done I think the MOCA initiative, which is something where there was a pilot of involving payers earlier in regulatory dialogues. But it is difficult. I think it's a very slow process, but the key point is I think to do pilots and case studies and to support and promote dialogues between payers and companies from early stages. But it's complex also because we have such a diverse payer landscape in Europe with as many different views on this topic as there are countries.
Thomas.
So it's at the moment it's more sort of a conceptual manner.
Let me jump to Thomas here, Peter. Thomas, from your perspective, from the industry side, do you see some of these IMI projects potentially helping unite the payers with some of these new methodologies?
Well, yeah, I mean that's one of the objectives, to try to bring everyone around the table, because I think one of the problems is that traditionally it's been a very fragmented discussion. The regulators do their thing, and then the product is out, and then the HTA in the countries that have HTA look at this and what is this, and then the payers come later, and we need a much more joined up discussion. And I think that the answer to the question, I think that as you said, this is a lot driven by the science and the new kind of product. So in the end, there's not much choice. I mean, you have to accept it.
We're going to have to do something.
And so you have to find a new model. So
I'm going to leave the last word here with the regulator. How do you see these things working going forward?
Well, thank you, but I am not a regulator. I'm a Chief Information and Innovation Officer. So
I'll leave it with the innovator then.
Indeed, I'm the troublemaker, and I keep people in Estonia also busy with thinking how we can make use of the opportunities that we do know are available there. Not only in a theoretical way, but actually we do have projects which have delivered results that we can and should use. So what we came up with the EU presidency period is that to get together the countries in the label coalition of the willing or coalition of the doing, and come half the way and meet the operational level people, clinicians, researchers, industry, and see where we can start implementing it fast in the areas, in the countries, regions where there is readiness, and then bring along all the others.
That's great. Ein, we'd like to thank you very much for your hospitality. Thank you very much this afternoon.
My pleasure.
Peter on the phone, thank you very much for your input today, Peter. Peter has left the building. Stanimir, thank you very much for your input and your participation.
Always ready to help.
Thank you. And Thomas, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening today. This webinar is concluded. Thank you very much, everyone.